Hi guys, welcome back to the weekly Monday night questions and answers and chats with Les Crowder and myself. I'm your host, Natalie B. And I'm a Texas A&M master beekeeper with about 10 years experience. And I have the immense privilege of working with Les Crowder, who is an expert beekeeper and a biologist, a philosopher on his spare time. He's been keeping bees for as long as I've been alive, for about 51 years. And he specializes in natural treatment-free beekeeping and tabar hives. And we're here to answer your questions. And tonight, Les wanted to talk about, let me admit people before I forget, admit everybody. Welcome everyone who are joining us for this chat this week, and our friends from far and near in Texas. Sherry Lane, Brad is here, Richard. I'm not going to name everybody, but I'm glad to see y'all here tonight. It's good to have you back. And Les wanted to talk tonight about things when things can get a little contentious. And there's a lot of different opinions in beekeeping that we all have our own philosophies and our different levels of experience and education. And we like to tinker and very often we'll disagree about something. But it doesn't always go very in a friendly manner. And Les wanted to discuss a little bit some of the ways we can go about it so that we don't antagonize each other, and so that we can have a friendly discussion that's going to help us grow together. Right, Les?
Right, exactly. Good to see everybody. And this partly came from somebody, like I've posted some on Facebook, and I often get a lot of, yeah, right on, likes and all that, and that's great. But I like a little bit of a scientific pushback. If somebody would say, oh, but wait a minute, what are you doing about the mites? And don't you realize that this level of mites is really bad for your bees and you should do something about it? And often they'll quote some studies or something, but let me just give you an example here. Somebody wrote back about following the biological line, as that is evidently so well protected from opinion. Well, nothing's protected from opinion, obviously, not mine or anybody else's. We all have a lot of opinion. And that's probably the main issue, is that we kind of come into it predisposed a little bit, and that's always a little bit dangerous. It always has me smiling to read the testimonials of surviving well, the surviving well play card being played as a prelude to the claims of success. When just one view of the bee's exoskeleton of a survivor bee demonstrates the damage that Varroa destructor does to bees. Well, I'm not saying, none of us are saying that Varroa doesn't do damage. Obviously, the Varroa mite does damage. I remember keeping bees before Varroa mite, and it was much easier for a number of reasons. There were also fewer pesticides being used. There were more crude, direct pesticides, so the pesticide directly killed the bee, and then we could wind up getting it banned eventually. But now we have pesticides that at very low levels do brain damage to bees. So we're not even measuring that. The companies are often in charge of doing their own tests anyway. The EPA doesn't test and check on the companies, and all they want to do is the LD50. They don't want to check on brain damage or long-term damage. They don't want a long test. They want a short test. So we have very limited research, and most of the blame then goes to Varroa for bees not living as long and being damaged. Certainly, Varroa does damage to bees. But so then he goes on to say, So we claim that they're surviving well, but that's scientific proof, as if that were scientific proof that the mites can do no damage, and that we've got bees that are mite resistant. So then what I did is, and I put this up on my Facebook page, a very well described in-depth paper done by several scientists that show how mite treatments all over the world, how people aren't treating in much of the world, particularly in Africa, South America, and the Caribbean, and that they managed to get quite a few, crops of honey, and they make divides. Now, this is not to say that the varroa mite doesn't do any damage, but the bees have greatly, greatly limited the amount of damage that they do. And part of the problem is that there's so many traits that bees have. They list in that paper quite a few traits. Grooming, and they show, for instance, that grooming, like the Africanized bees in Puerto Rico, spend 10 to 30 minutes once they get alerted that they have a mite on them. They spend 10 to 30 minutes making sure they get the mite off. And then they go the extra mile and bite the mite, sometimes cut it right in half before they drop it. And this has been verified by scientists in Puerto Rico. And it's a mite-resistant trait if there was any, right? And then another trait is brood breaks, frequent brood breaks whenever there's a lack of flowers. The brood breaks force the mites to become phoretic out on the adult bees, and then if they have the grooming trait, and this is the key, you need all of these traits or several of these traits at once, then the mites get phoretic on the adult bees and then get groomed off and thrown out of their dead bodies out of the beehive. And so we definitely have a biological path to varroa tolerance and varroa resistance. There's the varroa sensitive hygiene trait. So when the mite bites the larvae or pupae bee in the cocoon, it lets off an alarm pheromone. The bees uncap and throw the bee larvae and the mite out, and that stops the mite from reproducing. There's the uncapping trait that somehow seems to slow or stop the mite from reproducing, where they just uncap it, leave it uncapped for a while, and then cap it back. And then there's one that we've talked about, we used to talk about, the suppressed mite reproduction trait. And it seems to be just a trait that has chemical cues that prevent the mite from laying eggs in the larvae. So there are numerous traits that absolutely verify that Apis mellifera can become mite tolerant or mite resistant. And that doesn't even count the fact that, for instance, recently they did measure mite reproductive rates, the rates at which the mites reproduce once they get in the pupal bee inside the cocoon. And they found in Cuba that they were reproducing much slower than they had been reported reproducing earlier in the United States. I believe that all the mites are slowing down because the mites that reproduce really fast kill their hosts, and then themselves. And so that's putting a natural selection towards mites that don't kill their host and reproduce more slowly. So between that and the grooming and et cetera, we're going to slowly develop a balance in our beekeeping that leads us to mite tolerance and mite resistance. When I started keeping bees in the 70s, there were no varroa mites. There were the pesticides, bears, American and European foul brood were the main things we talked about. Chalk brood and some other things were kind of minor little issues, but we had no dream or nightmare of there being a varroa mite. Never heard of it, had no idea what it was. But back then it was often stated with a lot of anger. Foul brood is so virulent these days that you can't keep bees without antibiotics. And beekeepers who did not use antibiotics all winter to prevent foul brood were considered terrible, irresponsible, disease-spreading SOBs. That was a term mostly used back in those days. All the beekeepers were men, so you could get away with that. But
some people still try to get away with that.
Yeah, well, it seems to be nowadays they'd probably come up with a different term. Seems like we're slowly changing our cuss words, and they probably, because this would be somebody who was angry at me with veins showing in the neck, their face turning red, and they were very angry. Now, I've got this opinion that anger comes from fear. And so they're afraid that my lack of antibiotic use or my lack of miticide use is going to create a problem in my bees that's going to spread to their bees. And that's what the mite bomb later got to be named. Oh, you don't treat your bees, they're all going to get terrible mites. They're all going to get weak, and then our bees are going to come in and rob your bees, and we're going to get mites everywhere, and it's all your fault because you're a terrible beekeeper who refuses to treat your bees. And the thing about that is, I monitored mite populations back in the early days when they got way out of hand and then killed the bees if we didn't do something. And I've quickly found more natural ways to try to reduce the mite damage. But I don't see that at all these days. The huge majority of bees in Texas all have a fair amount of mite resistance, and I have yet to see a terrible mite explosion anywhere in Texas ever since I've been here since 2016. And I didn't see it in New Mexico. It was much worse at the beginning. The bees are getting much more mite resistant now. The other thing that I find interesting is that back in those days, they used to recommend you had to use tetracycline. And they came up with ways to administer it so that it would be in the hive for a very long time during the winter. You weren't supposed to use it in the summer because it would get in the honey. And that's, of course, a problem with putting antibiotics in our food. And so now it's the same thing with the mites. Should you treat twice, or when should you treat, and coming up with ways to treat. But we have bees that make strong brood breaks when there is a dearth in the flowers that causes the bees to be phoretic, the mites to get phoretic. And then we have groomer bees that pick them off once they get out on the adult bees and greatly reduce the population of mites. That to me is mite resistance. Now this particular person says, well, that's just claiming that they survived is mite resistance. I'm not saying that. I'm saying they survived, and they survived well. They reproduced, they swarmed, or they got near to swarming, and I made a divide, and they made some honey to spare. They filled the beehive. Nature measures fitness success by reproduction. If they can reproduce, if they can survive, great. If they can survive and reproduce, they're fit. And so by nature's measure, untreated bees that survive and get ready to swarm in the spring are fit bees that are ready to survive in spite of the parasite. But what do we do? Part of the problem is, if we try to debate it, we have as examples our political debates, which aren't really debates. They're just seeing who can be the most, offer the most put downs and be the meanest and angriest. And that's not a way to scientifically determine whether bees can survive, or whether bees are getting more and more mite resistant or not. That's just a way to separate us. And we have a lot of that. We have people that come to our club because they say that in their club, if they dare to say that they're not treating, they're likely to get kicked out of the club or put down, shunned, because they're supposed to treat, because they don't treat, they're going to be mite bombs and spread mites everywhere.
I've
Let
heard
me
some
show
people.
that. Go ahead, Natalie.
Oh, I apologize for the interruption. I was just kind of agreeing with you. I've heard some people actually get yelled at or belittled or just kind of, ridiculed in front of the entire beekeeping meeting. And I don't think that's called for. It's not. So my position is, if you've got to resort to that to basically quiet the person who's talking, that means you don't have anything else to discuss. You don't have a way to interact in a intelligent way. You're not sure of your own knowledge. If you were, you would be open to a discussion that would be civil, right?
Right, and keeping civility, it's hard when somebody disagrees with you, it's easy to get this flare of indignation. Like, wow, you stupid. I know I'm right and you're wrong. But if we can listen to each other, then we can start to say, okay, well, what about this, and what about the different mite resistant traits and so forth. But the problem is we kind of come into it with a belief system, and we don't really want to have that belief system broken or holes put in it. So we get angry, and then once people start yelling, and I've seen that happen at bee meetings, there's no convincing anybody that's yelling at you or calling you stupid or whatever, because like this one particular sentence here, they hope that people in Australia can keep working where there is no VD, Varroa destructor. And, I hope that they don't have to spread Varroa destructor through Australia either, because there's no doubt that Varroa does some damage. And the viruses that they introduce do some damage. That's coupled with all the other ways that we do them damage by limiting their nectar sources through habitat destruction, and then by the vast array of pesticides that we've spread into the environment and that we put into the bees. So if we can get bees to survive and reproduce without treatment, and we can get them to survive and reproduce with treatment, which of the treatments is powerful enough to kill the mites and doesn't affect the bees at all? None of them. The treatments are also negative, or kind of like chemotherapy for the bee. They do damage to the bee. They do damage to the mites. Hopefully they do more damage to the mites than they do to the bees. And then they only kill the mites for relatively few months. And they don't kill all the mites. And that's the other problem, is that when they don't kill all the mites, that leads the mites to slowly but surely breed resistance to the pesticide, the miticide, as we might call it, that we've chosen to use, or the mite treatment. Even like enforcing a brood break could be considered a treatment, but at least it's a natural. The bees do that on their own if we don't do it, or we simply witness it. That's what we did here in Austin. We had a great spring, then the flowers stopped, it got hot, and the bees initiated a fierce brood break. Well, that meant all the mites had nowhere to reproduce and had to come out on the adult bees, where they were likely to get groomed. Now, there'd be the argument that, well, that's great if you live where there's Africanized bees that are mite resistant. Well, it's also great wherever there's Russian bees in the north, wherever there's varroa sensitive hygiene bees. These traits are spreading throughout the bee population all over, and we can help with that. And that's where I tell people, if you think your bees are pretty mite resistant, but you want to try some Russian bees, that's a great thing. It could bring in a little bit of genetic diversity into our bees. In the end, if you just let bees go, they're going to kind of adopt the background local kind of mud variety that we have going in your whatever neighborhood you're in, right? But if we try to bring in some carniolan or some super bee that whatever you read that made you think, oh, that's really cool, I'm going to try that. Try it, absolutely, and especially try an F1. Try to raise some queens from a Russian bee or there's the Saskatoon, or there's all different kinds. People, mite biters, and all these different ideas people are bringing up. And I think that's worth a try. But don't put down people who are breeding for mite resistance. And it doesn't bother me. If you want to treat your bees, you're afraid you're going to lose your bees, and you want to treat them with some kind of miticide. This doesn't threaten me. I'm not the least bit angry with anybody that uses mite treatments. I think we will eventually outgrow the need for that. But if we're not there, we're not there. And a lot of us aren't there. So, but the thing we want to watch out for is to make sure we don't keep breeding bees that are miticide dependent. And we actually wind up breeding mites that are miticide dependent. So we save mites that would have killed themselves once they killed their host, but we save them with a miticide. And that seems awfully odd, right? Kind of ironic that we could be saving overly virulent mites with our miticides, our attempt to kill mites. But that could be the case. So let's use them only when they're absolutely necessary, and try to believe that some of your bees will survive without miticides. I remember once I heard about Dr. Robert Danka saying to the commercial beekeepers, mostly pollinators, you should take 10% or even 1%. Like if you have 10,000 hives, take 100 and don't treat them and breed from the survivors. And the man next to me said, oh, you mean kill 100 beehives? And he's trying to say, no, you won't kill 100 beehives. You might kill 50, you might kill only 20 or something, who knows? But if you breed from your survivors, you'll be breeding for mite resistance. It can be done. It is being done. Beekeepers all over Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean and have done it. And I'm going to post again on my Facebook page the most recent study that showed that scientists went to Puerto Rico after the hurricane did so much damage. During Maria a couple of years ago now, or last year, and they found that the mites were not a problem. The bees were very good groomers, and that they were killing the mites. Mm-hmm. And if the Puerto Rican beekeepers can do it, I'm sure the American beekeepers can do it. And it isn't just because we have Africanized bees. It's because we're allowing bees and mites to reach an equilibrium that allows them to survive. Would I like to do without mites? Of course. But that's not the world we're ever going to live in ever again. I remember it well. It was great while it lasted. It's never coming back. We cannot eradicate the mite. We have to learn to live with the mite. We have to stop poisoning bees and mites in order to try to mechanically or chemically kill the mite. We need to start using biology to fight our biological problems, to solve our biological problems, rather than toxic chemistry. I am an example of somebody who was treated with disrespect as a farm worker, working for a beekeeper, where I was administering ethylene dibromide to fumigate supers for wax moths. And I believe that the cancer that I later got was a direct result of the exposure to a highly carcinogenic chemical that we were at the time told was fine and not to worry about. It's just a poison to moths. It won't kill, it won't hurt you. Well, now they got, in the 80s, it got banned because it was killing farm workers, giving farm workers cancer. So, it only takes a few of those to make you very leery when they say, oh, it's fine, it won't hurt you.
Right. Have
Yeah.
some
Yeah,
critical
told me.
thinking. Yeah. So I wanted to take a little levity break. I'm watching the exchanges on the YouTube channel of Be Mindful LLC, and I've got Bruce and Swarmstead Bees and Gardening, and I've got Monty from Suburban Southbuster and his Layens Hives in his education, and I've got our friend Teresa's on there, and I've got George and Candy Jane. So it's nice to have everybody there, but there's a little bit of talking about, we're going back to some of the things you were saying earlier, Les. Basically, Monty started by saying, what did he say? Oh, no. That was Bruce. Hang on a second. I'm just kind of backtracking here. He said basically, Bruce, obviously being the antagonizer that he is, he says, send them to me, those people that are kind of rude or aggressive or really kind of like really not pleasant to interact with. And then Monty says, we'd all get along better if everyone would come around to my viewpoint, right? So I kind of think that everybody feels that way. And
So far, I'm the only perfectly normal person I've ever met.
That's your favorite quote. So my favorite Les Crowder quote. And then Monty adds, but seriously, Les is spot on. That anger comes out of fear. That applies to so many areas. And yes, it sure does. And I think that part of the problem is that we're not willing to question our own philosophy. We're not willing to be nuanced. Not everything is black and white, right? And there's a lot of value in other people's knowledge and experience that we should be able to civilly debate, or actually just have constructive, discussions about it. And I think that the fear that creates that anger comes from cognitive dissonance, right? It's a we are being we experience it as, because they're telling us that what we believe in is not reality, we are being attacked, we're under attack, and it just feels scary. And so we react, we knee jerk, and we tend to not want to hear it. And it's true of everything out there. So, I think that it behooves us to try to not bite each other's heads off and just kind of have a debate. And so when we encounter people that are, very judgmental, very belittling, very condescending, or downright aggressive and unpleasant, there's several ways to deal with that. And I know that Bruce has his way to deal with it, and he takes them on full from just kind of completely addresses it, and he's very calmly calling out the inconsistencies, and he actually triggers their cognitive dissonance quite a bit. So it ends up sometimes I've seen some reactions that were interesting. I used to work a little bit from that standpoint, where I was trying to rationalize things, and I didn't have a lot of experience 10 years ago, right? So I was trying to discuss with people some of the things I was learning from Les and other of my mentors and heroes, and I didn't have enough depth of expertise and knowledge to really back it up. And there was a lot of cliches and baiting, words and just kind of like, you treat your dogs for fleas and you should treat your bees, and just kind of comparisons of apples and elephants basically. And so it's hard to deal with that because it kind of leaves you without a lot of good comebacks. But what I ended up doing, and I don't know if that might be useful to anybody, is finding the good mentors, spending time learning from them, really deepening your knowledge, getting your education from wherever you can, getting more experience under your belt, having more bees, experimenting with a lot more things, and just going to speak from experience. That's going to help you really have more critical thinking and just kind of flip things back and forth in your head. It's okay to change your mind. Just remember that. It's okay if somebody has completely different results than you have. And Richard and I were talking about video and research from, I forget what the name is, but basically, and you probably are going to put it down in the comments so I can kind of remember what it was. But they did a research on 3 different groups of beekeepers with control groups and just kind of different beekeeping styles. And they were talking about philosophy, right? Your philosophy is going to really instruct your way to keep your bees, if you're going to feed, if you're going to treat, if you're going to do any of that stuff, if you're more wanting to be natural or not. And the results were very, very interesting. But the result on their chemical free was basically, they were saying from 96 colonies they started with, 3 years later, they had 1 left. And that was the worst group. And so, but we know from experience, that's not how that works for us. So what is it? I'm trying to ask the questions, all the questions possible about the protocols, about everything. And I really want to talk to that lady because that's not that's not our reality. So what happened is my question. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, we're often told, well, if you don't treat, they're going to die.
Right.
And we just looked at your hive at your house here recently that you haven't really touched or done anything to for about 7 years. And we've looked at it almost at once a month for all those years. It's continuously full of bees. It's still full of bees. It's very heavy. They haven't died.
So, but Les, I want to just kind of jump in since there's a little bit of a lull. Bruce Rodriguez from Swamstead Bees and Gardening said he was briefly a part of it and it was run terribly. So I'd be curious to learn a little bit more and talk to you about it. And yes, it is about the COMB study, the COMB study. That's comparing those 3 groups. That's exactly what it is. And Richard added it's Underwood. I guess I think it's her name. And so I want to know more about that. But when you have something that's basically really full strength, hitting your cognitive dissonance, instead of, you catch yourself, you feel a little bit of feeling defensive, a little bit of getting a little bit angry at that person and at that group. But in the end, you need to step back and just kind of, okay, what is this about, this that's triggering me, and how can we learn about this, and ask the questions, have critical thinking, and just start asking, because if it's really dissonant, there might be a reason for it.
Right. And the thing is, if we were to do a study with our experience with bees, first of all, I'd be reluctant to do a study where we use chemicals because I just don't like using them at all. And we'd probably come up with, our bees that didn't get treated did very well, and the bees that got treated didn't do well. Because we know that treatment often doesn't help the bees survive much better than not treating, according to some studies. But the problem is that dissonance, or that we come into it with our own philosophy from the beginning. And my issue is, how do we reduce toxicity? Having been a farm worker, worked with Mexican farm workers quite a bit as a kid, seeing the disrespect and the fact that they get sprayed with pesticides their kids get higher rates of autism, that made me feel like, we need to respect life enough not to use so much poison. And the problem with the word pesticide or miticide or acaricide is that it's basically a powerful poison that we want to sell for a purpose. It isn't be specifically targeted to a pest or a mite. It will kill bees, it will kill people. And so my bias is, if we can come up with a way to keep bees and mites together that doesn't require a poison, that's better than one that does. And so we can search for, and if we search, we will find it. There's people finding ways to grow beans and not have their beans destroyed by Colorado bean beetle on a fairly large scale by finding predators and natural ways to protect the plants from the bean beetle. So we can search, if we look for it, we'll find it. We can still make money. We can still participate in agriculture. We just have to change the agriculture.
So Richard posted the comb study summary. I will post it on the YouTube channel in a second. I want to remind everybody while I'm going through the comments that if you have questions about your bees or your apiaries or your yards or anything whatsoever, even if it doesn't have anything to do with the theme for the day, we're here to answer your questions. So don't hesitate to ask them. I want to say hi to all of our apprentices that are joined tonight. And also Brad makes a good point. He says that it seems to him that more treated hives died this year than last year. I've always thought that there was usually a pretty, like the Bee Informed Partnership studies didn't really show a significant difference between the losses between the treated and non-treated. In our experience, we've seen a lot of the treated hives die. We don't treat, so we don't have first-hand experience. We can't talk about it. That's another thing that, by the way, I want to caution people. A lot of people will make statements about what good this type of hive is or what, drawbacks this type of hive has without having ever tried those other styles of hives. So if you want to kind of have a conversation with people, just kind of try to figure out what is their actual direct experience with some of the things that they are talking about. I'm finding a lot of people bashing tabar hives, for example, don't have tabar hives, right? So something to keep in mind.
And that's something that, even way back in the old days with foul brood, you can breed for mite or disease resistance, and that's a valid point. And that, by the way, I have a 1929 or 1930 ABC XYZ of beekeeping book, and that's what they say in that book was, if you see foul brood, here's what it looks like, here's what it smells like. What do? You breed with resistant stock. So they had that down in the 1800s. In the early 1900s. And then we seem to have forgotten it once we got antibiotics. We got cognitive dissonance. We decided, now we're going to put antibiotics in everything and make life better through modern chemistry. And then we realized later, that actually isn't a good idea because we're breeding superbugs. And we're not stopping the disease. The disease is just getting resistant to the antibiotic that we're using, and that just doesn't work. So little by little, we're finding that nature has been finding ways to resist and survive or go extinct. And we can depend on nature, and bees have shown us numerous ways that they can resist the mites. And we just need to let those traits develop over time and fuse so that the bees have the grooming trait and the VSH trait and break their brood more easily. Some bees are very reluctant to break their brood. Some break it pretty quickly. And that brood break stops the mites from reproducing and makes them be phoretic. And then if they have the grooming trait, the mites are pretty much gone from the beehive. in a short amount of time because the bees took care of it all by themselves without any poison or any effort from us. So we're so often trying to feed them and stop brood breaks, but we should allow a certain amount of brood breaks and encourage that as a mite resistant trait.
Mhm. So Kasha says, I love this conversation to the core. Thank you so much. Pretty often I get the question, how long did my hive survive without treating? Which is one of the trigger questions, right? It's one of the typical, what was your mite count? Did you treat? Oh, if your hives died and you treated, then you didn't do it right, right? So there's always moving the goalposts. You never, I mean, some people have a lot of practice at it. So you have to kind of learn on the boards. This is what I did. You learn all the questions, all the pushbacks, kind of think about it very thoroughly, kind of think about why it is that doesn't make any sense or why it doesn't necessarily always matter. Just kind of assimilate that and be prepared, because that's always the same questions that are coming back. And at some point, you add up to your toolbox and you kind of have all those in mind and you can discuss intelligently about them. So one of the things that she said is, they say 1 year doesn't prove that yet. Well, then, you keep bees for 3 years and they'll tell you why it really takes 5 years. Well, I've had a hive that has been alive for 7, 8 years without any, oh, well, it really takes 20 years. What are you talking about? A colony doesn't even live that long in nature. So what are we really trying to prove here? So I mean, there's all kinds of things that people will throw at you. Just kind of calmly collect them. You can even make a collection with each of those themes because they regularly come back, and just kind of think this through. So Richard says, Cash, great point. I have the same question as you do. So to answer your question, usually I think people will say 3 years to kind of see if you haven't had forced any kind of like splitting or anything. You just kind of try to collect that queen. And so a colony itself, that's the other aspect of things. It's kind of, we need to talk about the same things, right? A colony, if they swarm or if you split it, very often you take away that old queen, right? So you've got a fresh new queen in there. That's really a different colony, right? The one that's leaving with the old queen, that's the original, genetic makeup. So what are we really comparing here? Because open mating makes it a completely different animal, really, once they come back and start laying. But yeah, usually Les, what's your take on that? I think that 3 years is enough, and then 5 years to be sure. I think that what I've heard is that if we had let the bees take care of themselves, and what Bee Weaver, Danny Weaver has been saying is that after 3 to 4 years is when he was testing his survivals. He lost a lot of colonies, but after 3-4 years, he had his survivor stock. What is your take on that?
Yeah, and the guy in Italy many years ago, back in the 90s, wrote an article that he showed that it took about 8 years. He was measuring feral bee colonies in Italy. He was very proud of his Italian bee heritage. Oh, they're the best bees in the world, and blah, blah, blah. And then they all died. All the feral hives mostly all died when the vermite came to Italy. And he was devastated. And then he went out, he kept checking year after year, and they were empty, and they were empty. And about the third year, he started seeing a few bees, then they'd disappear again. And the fourth year, he started seeing bees that stayed. And by the fifth year, they were back and filled all the old sites. And now he was super proud of his Italian bees that had proved their mite resistance. This was back in the 90s. So this was a long time ago. I personally think that once you get through 2 years now, I believe that there's going to be more and more mite resistance in the background population of bees. Mm-hmm. The feral population, and just everybody's bees are getting more mite resistant, even though they don't believe they are. And that by letting them requeen themselves, they're requeening. And Tom Seeley showed that the feral bees were introducing their genes into the kept bee population more than the other way around in New York. So that means the feral colonies are developing mite resistance, and they're going to help us with that. And so if you keep them alive for 1 year, that's almost proof enough right there. Second year, your bees are doing fine, because why would a bunch of mites wait a couple of years? They can breed very fast once they get going. Their reproduction rate tends to get exponential. And so once you get enough mites in a beehive, it either goes till it kills the bees or keeps getting put down by the bees and never gets there. And that's going to be evident even in the second year. So I think your bees are doing great, and they're never going to believe. If you say, oh, it takes 7 years, if you say, oh, they're fine after 7 years, oh, it takes 8 or 9 years, well, they're never going to be satisfied, and they're never going to believe you actually don't treat. People have told me, well, Danny Weaver secretly gets out there and treats his bees. That's not true, but that's because you can't believe that they don't, so they must do something. And once you get to that point where everybody that believes what I believe is telling the truth, everybody that doesn't believe what I believe is lying,
Right.
there's no convincing. It's just waste of time.
So a couple of observations as well is when you have a colony that's lived in the wild in the same cavity for a long time, say 6-7 years, I believe Dr. Seeley says that after that they usually die because that comb gets so old and it's not getting replaced by beekeepers anyway. So there's no way to really necessarily keep the same colonies, even if they don't swarm, much longer than that to begin with. So there's all kinds of parameters that come into place. To your point, Les, with that spike in mites in the fall, all of their measurements were done. They were looking at October measurements with the mites, and they had spikes. You're right, but equating the spikes in mites with the loss of a colony is not necessarily a cause and effect, right? Some of our colonies have very high mite populations, and it's true when there's a brood break and the mites become phoretic, and if you test at that point, that's when you're going to have the highest number of mites anyway, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that colony can't take care of the mite load, because that brood break has broken the mite cycle of reproduction at the same time, right? So those bees that we have don't necessarily die of a high mite load, and we have some that are exploding in the spring after having been tested with high mite loads. So I don't see, I mean, I understand there's some cause and effect. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the end of the colony. And also, to your point earlier, it puts that pressure on the colony to try and survive even in the presence of that pest. It's pressuring them to get stronger, the bees, instead of putting pressure on the mites.
And that's the role of parasites and predators. And sure, it'd be nice if there weren't so many parasites and predators, but that's not the world we live in. And if we look at the high mite count right as the brood has broken, and so that there's no place for the mites to do but come out, why don't we check it a little bit later, particularly if we've got groomers, because then we'll see that the phoretic mites get killed to a great extent, which is like they did in Apis cerana. Apis cerana, you hardly find any mites, even though they breed at full tilt, because there was hardly ever drones. They can't reproduce in worker Apis cerana. And then whenever they got phoretic, they'd get groomed off. So it was hard for the mite to make a living in Apis cerana, and now it's getting hard to make a living in Apis mellifera.
Now, I want to remind everybody that there's also bees and bees. They're not all bees are created equal, right? And to Brad's point, if my feral bees last 3 years and my store-bought bees last 2 years, what does that actually prove? If I didn't treat either one, I would go a step further. If it's not the same quality of stock, if you're working and comparing feral or wild colonies and treated Italian commercial bees, we're really not, I don't know what kind of stock they started with. I know that in that home study, they requeened with all the colonies were requeened with supposedly treatment-free survivor stock that was local. So I really want to dig into this. I mean, I encourage everybody to kind of go and dig into it. And Bruce said they had test yards not far down the road, basically. So I really want to talk to Bruce about this from Swarmstead Bees and Gardenings, who, by the way, was laughing because of the point I was making earlier. He said we should all make flashcards, basically, with the comments and the arguments that come back in a theme. Brad says, too bad comments from both sides don't all show up for everyone. Oh yeah, I know you can't really go back and forth, but if you're dialing into Zoom, into your YouTube channel, you can do both. I usually try to read both, so we can try to go do it that way. Oh yeah, Kasha said, I love the idea. We need a manual, basically, just the question and answers, typical ones.
Well, we've been threatening to set up, make a manual of our own. We've also been threatening to set up another natural beekeeping conference. Maybe in the Austin area sometime. We just need an organizer, and it'll happen.
We have organizers last. Georgia and I are working on it, and we've got people wanting to help, including Brad, actually, and some other people. Where you've been voluntold as one of the keynote speakers. But we're gonna get quite a few, and I want to invite actually Bruce and Monty if they can make it, and we're just gonna have a big old natural, treatment-free, chemical-free, biological conference. We're working on that for early 2024 because it's going to take us that long to really organize in person.
It's a complex thing to do.
Yeah,
we have a lot of science on our side. Some of these things that I'm going to publish in this Facebook page and put it on Instagram or whatever shows very serious studies I've done over many years that measure the mite resistant traits of bees, or the mite resistances of bees in Puerto Rico. And science is definitely saying, yes, there is mite resistance in Apis mellifera. So all we have to do is keep enhancing that. And we don't enhance that by resorting to poison.
And I also encourage everybody, I mean, it's hard to do, and I still catch myself when you have somebody that's really being argumentative and brutal and condescending and just not really friendly, to kind of catch yourself and take a step back and take the emotion out of your responses if you can. Because if you leave your emotions in there, that's only going to put oil on the fire. So one of the strategies is to completely go clinical and just stick to the facts. No, I think, or anything like that. It's just kind of my experience is this is what I've seen, or this is what the study says, potentially, although that can get down a rabbit hole on its own. But just and rely on the respected sources. Like Dr. Seeley is a great treasure trove of quotes and information that we can use to basically give some weight to the comebacks. But just, it's not a battle, y'all. And the sooner we learn that, the more we can debate and have discussions without getting all worked up, and we can make our point across a little bit more efficiently. I'm saying do as I say and not do as I do sometimes. We're all humans and it's okay, right? But it's just kind of catch yourself and be mindful of how you're reacting and what buttons are being pushed and why that is.
I appreciate you saying it's not a battle. This is something that I've been dealing with, this kind of issue, for almost 50 years, starting with antibiotics and then miticides, and it isn't, you're never going to convince everybody, and you don't need to worry about it or even try. Just steadily keep enjoying having bees. I enjoy it much more. I did use terramycin after I didn't use it at all, and then I had foul brood and I started using it, and then I read that I could breed for disease resistance. I completely dropped it. I was predisposed not to use toxic chemistry. And so I now recognize that that was my predisposition. But I have spent many years with these kinds of fights. And so sometimes you start getting in an argument, just this isn't worth it. You're never going to convince certain people.
So Bruce says, hey, that's a good book idea. How to respond to treater cliches. It's still a little bit triggering there on the title, though, I would say. But here's another technique. Always find common ground. What can you agree with your interlocutor, and start with that. And then gently delve into what if, and have you considered this, and ask questions instead of making statements. Try to not use you pointing the fingers. Don't be condescending. Don't be belittling. I have a bad problem with being sarcastic and just trying to, passive aggressive. I tend to do that. But knowing that, you've realized it's a technique, it's a defense mechanism to avoid direct confrontation. And so once you get a hold of yourself on that, you can just, again, take that emotion out of it. Don't tell people what they should do. Everybody loves their bees. Everybody's trying to do best based on their philosophies, and which can differ, right? So they're entitled to keep the bees the way they want to, but just express your personal experience, and I think that helps as well. So that helps cooling off the heat that comes into some of those conversations.
But also, back in the past, when I first stopped using antibiotics, people thought I was just completely off in left field or weird. What I'm seeing is that there's a lot more of us now, and we can push back and say, no, we have the right to not put poison in the beehives. And our bees are fine. We're not spreading mites. Don't worry about it. But back off. Don't start yelling at me in a meeting and try to put me down, because I'm a very competent beekeeper and I know exactly what I'm doing. Having
that competency really helps. And I think that to your theme, Les, we rise together. So there's another aspect of things that I've learned over the years to kind of be less tribal about, for example, tabar hives, and we all are here fighting, not fighting. We all are defending, in a way, natural beekeeping and treatment-free techniques, but we could do it together. Like Monty keeps Layton's hive. Dr. Sharashkin is doing it with that. But there's a unifying theme of trying to go as naturally and as biologically as possible in the way we raise our bees. And instead of competing with each other, we can just kind of band together and hence that big bee school. Les, there's a story that I love you telling about, and I'm not going to name the famous beekeeper that played a role in that story, but one beekeeper was trying to measure the cell sizes of your natural comb and the way that your bees were building them. And she disagreed because she was doing some research for a project, and she disagreed completely, and she cursed you out, didn't she, on the phone?
She said that my bees should all be building very small cell size, like 4.8, because they had been building natural all on their own for quite a while, and she thought they would naturally regress to 4.8. When I measured up at the top corner. That was the biggest cells, and they were almost like 5.0 or something. And then she cussed me out, and she said, your bees are stupid bees. They don't know what the hell they're doing. And then I got mad and hung up on her and went and measured the same comb down at the bottom center, and they were much smaller. And I realized, wait a minute, the bees, who am I to tell the bees what size of the comb they should live in? They apparently won from 5.0 down to 4.8, and that's fine. I don't have to worry about it. I let the bees pick whatever they want to live in. And later somebody told me, oh, but they'll build drone comb. Yep, they do. So they're free to do. They're bees. They know how to be bees better than I know for them to be a bee.
Exactly. Yeah, and Brad says, well, one way you can present it is, well, we're not against what you're doing, but we've chosen a different path. And
Exactly.
I will add, and we should be entitled to that path for ourselves, just the same way we're respecting your path, right? So don't come and tell us how to keep our bees either. We're not trying to tell you how to do that. Kaja said, I'd be very happy to support all this on my social media channels. Thank you so much. I've already said this goal is my mission. So let's talk and see how we can all band together, unite, and rise together. And then Monty was taking on Bruce. He said, Bruce generally needs a trigger warning. And so I'm just kind of saying, yeah, we love you. He's like, thumbs up, y'all. So yeah, no, this is all cool. I think that hopefully this was very helpful and can help diffusing some of the situations. I still tend to be a little defensive myself, and I try to catch myself as much as I can. It's a learning process, and we're all human. We can be gentle with ourselves and learn to be a little bit more gentle with our fellow humans, right? A little bit more mindful of how we interact, and that we're not really enemies here, because we're all trying to keep bees, and we're all beekeepers, and we all love the bees. We just do it differently sometimes, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
So
Yeah.
with this, I want to thank everybody for your comments and your questions. And really, we didn't get a whole lot of beekeeping questions tonight. It was more of just a general discussion. Hopefully that was helpful. And I really want to thank Les, as usual. He's the expert, and his wisdom has no bounds. I mean, the amount of knowledge that you have, Les, is really inspiring. But mostly the thoughtfulness and the mindfulness with which you interact with other people in your philosophy, not just with the bees, but with life in general. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for setting this all up. And I really appreciate seeing all you guys. And it gives me a lot of hope to see how many people are interested in natural beekeeping.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Next year.
And we got a lot of enthusiasm about the Natural Beekeeping Conference, so we'll keep you posted. So thank you, guys. Thank you all, and on YouTube as well. It's always a pleasure to have you guys. We'll talk to you next week on Monday at the same time. Thanks. Bye-bye.